Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò della New York University. We are delighted to have a chance to present with one of the authors the book Assassins Against the Old Order, Italian Anarchist Violence in Fin de Siècle, Europe. And we have the pleasure of having here with us Fraser Ottanelli, that many of you know. He's a professor of history at the University of South Florida. His areas of specialization include U.S. immigration, ethnic history, comparative migration, Italian migration, U.S. radical movements, 19th and 20th century Italian history. He is originally from Florence, from an Italian and American family, but not Italian-American, because it's a different constellation down there. And Anglo-Becero. And this is his last book. His previous books, and I just mentioned three more to give you a sense of the variety of interest that Professor Ottanelli cultivates. And the Asaba Massacre, Trauma, Memory, and the Nigerian Civil War, with Cambridge University Press in 2017, who is the recipient of the Oral History Association's Best Book of the Year award in 2017. And then in 2015, with Interstitial Cambridge, the Performance of Memory as Transitional Justice, and then Letters from the Spanish Civil War, a U.S. Volunteer Writes Home, a book that he co-authored and published with Kent State University Press 2013. And this also brings me to mention the fact that Fraser is one of the true and probably few remaining public intellectuals that intends his role not only at the chair that he has at the University of Florida, but really much broader. And the work that he does, for example, with ALBA, as one of the sitting in the Board of Governors, they're doing a remarkable work. ALBA is the Abraham Lincoln Brigades Archive that many of you know probably. The Abraham Lincoln Brigades were made of American volunteers that fought in Spain for the Republic and against fascism. And the archive is here in New York, but at NYU. But aside from preserving the il direttore. Aside from preserving the memory and the archive, ALBA promotes a variety of initiatives of education on civil rights and many other issues, and especially they foster the preparation of high school teachers to teach sensible topics in world history. So the job that Fraser does, again, goes way beyond the borders of the university in which he currently is, and we are very fortunate because we all enjoy and take advantage of his preparation and his commitment. And this book in particular has a very interesting genealogy, and I think we're probably going to start with that. Please welcome Fraser Ottanelli.
Thank you. Thank you, yes. Thank you, Stefano, and thank you for everybody who came on such a blistery cold night wet night to listen to this talk. Hey, how are you?
Hello.
Hi, Ben. So the title of the book is Assassins Against the Old Order. I always have to specify that, in spite of the current political circumstances, this is not a how-to guide, but it is a history book, and as Stefano mentioned, it is co-authored. I'm actually the second author on this book, not the first, and I'll say something about it, about the brief genesis of the book in a minute. But I do want to say a couple of things, and then, if you don't mind, I was going to read two relatively short sections of the book. The book starts from a very basic premise, and that is that during the 1890s, Italian anarchists compiled a formidable record of political assassinations. President Sadi Carnot of France was killed by Sante Caserio in 1894. Prime Minister Antonio Canovas of Spain was shot by Michele Angiolillo in 1897. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissi, was stabbed by Luigi Lucchini in 1898. And King Umberto of Italy was also shot by Gaetano Bresci, a returned immigrant from the United States, in 1900. Through a focus on these 4 political assassinations, the book offers a full-length study of the historical, the social, the cultural, and political conditions, along with a transnational experience in Italy, France, Spain, Switzerland, and the United States that led to Italian anarchist violence at the end of the 19th century. Most notably, the book also provides biographical portraits, and I think that's really the strength of the book. Biographical portraits, an analysis of the major Italian perpetrators of these political assassinations. As I mentioned earlier, the book is a product of a joint effort. In fact, the bulk of the research was done by Nunzio Pernicone. Nunzio, one of the country's foremost historians of Italian anarchism not just in Italy, but in the United States as well. As I recount in the introduction to the book, in the preface, Nunzio and I first met at a conference in 2001. And because of our shared interest, we kept in touch and eventually became friends. Those of you who know Nunzio or have known Nunzio probably know that it wasn't really the easiest thing to get to know him. He was a very, very reserved, but we finally broke through, so Nunzio would ask me to read and comment on his ongoing research. And in 2013, when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he pretty much told me that I was going to finish his book. I mean, there clearly was no issue about that. His exact words were that if I did not take it over, 10 years of research, these are his words, would end up gathering dust in a file cabinet. So that was it. Anyone who has read Nunzio's books, heard him lecture, or saw him as a talking head in various documentaries on Italian-American radicals or Italian-Americans in general, could not fail to appreciate his meticulous attention to detail, his extensive archival research on both sides of the Atlantic, and his distinctive skills as a storyteller. Nunzio was a great raconteur. He told stories, great stories, and he told them very, very well. But while he was a great storyteller, while he provided intimate accounts of the lives, of the values, and the actions of individual anarchists, he always made sure to place these stories within their broader economic, social, and political environment. At this point, I would like to read a section to kind of give you a sense of the way he did research and his ability to really give combined life stories with political and, with broader political and social issues. And this is the introduction, the part I'm going to read now, really tells a story introduces Sante Caserio, who's really the first one of these anarchist assassins of the late 19th century. Sante Geronimo Caserio. Born in Motta Visconti in Lombardy on September 9th, 1873, Caserio and his 5 brothers belonged to a very poor but close-knit family. His father came from peasant stock and worked as a bargeman on the Ticino River in the summer and as a woodcutter in the winter. The extreme poverty of the Caserio family was characteristic of economic conditions in Motta Visconti, 20 miles southwest of Milan, where child mortality was high and disease associated with poverty like scrofula, malaria, and pellagra were endemic. Caserio's father, Antonio, was alleged to have suffered from epilepsy, but Sante never manifested signs of the disease. Antonio's death in 1887 caused the family great hardship and strengthened Caserio's ties with his mother, Marina, a bond that remained intense until his demise. As a youth, Caserio was known to be very gentle and caring. He was also a fervent Catholic, serving as an altar boy at the local church and playing a part of St. John in the annual procession devoted to the patron saint of the town. Of normal stature, with blond hair and bright blue eyes, Caserio retained the appearance of a boy even when he had reached maturity. Like most youth of his social class, Caserio's education was terminated after the second grade, and by the age of 11 he was working to assist his mother and brothers, first as a shoemaker helper and then as a shop boy in his uncle's wine store in Milan. At age 13, Caserio apprenticed at Milano's renowned Le Tre Marie bakery, where he toiled for very long hours at night. The owner considered him a very hardworking and reliable employee. Caserio eventually joined the Bakers' Mutual Aid Society, where he met anarchists and socialists and began voraciously reading their newspapers and pamphlets and attending their lectures. More than subversive literature, however, it was Caserio's acute sensitivity to the dreadful conditions suffered by the Milanese proletariat and the hardship of his own life that transformed him into an anarchist. When not engaged in propaganda activities, Caserio spent all his free time reading anarchist newspapers, pamphlets, and other literature. His lifestyle was ascetic. He rarely smoked, never drank, and abstained from sexual activity. Asked if he had ever made love to a woman, Caserio explained that he once did, but would refrain until he found the right girl to be his companion. One evening, Caserio encountered a group of acquaintances just as they were emerging from a brothel. Caserio reproached them for abusing women by purchasing their flesh, to which one of them replied that they had relieved their misery with payment for their services. Angered by the sarcastic reply, Caserio sprang up the stairs, gave one of the women a lira, and then returned without saying a word. Exceedingly generous, he was often observed distributing anarchist literature and fresh loaves of bread to workers outside the Camera di Lavoro, the Chamber of Labor, bread and pamphlets purchased with his own money. He explained that, and I quote, "It would be an insult to give printed matter to a person thin from hunger, rather than satisfy his stomach before reading. This way they're better able to understand what they read." Caserio's extraordinary empathy for human tragedy, even when it befell class enemies. One evening, while attending Paolo Giacometti's Maria Antonietta at the Commedia di Milano theater, Caserio's eyes overflowed with tears during the last act, when King Louis XVI and his despised spouse, Marie Antoinette, were led away to the guillotine. So he even showed sympathy for them. Nothing up to that point suggested that Caserio was capable of violence. A friend observed only 2 occasions when a flash of genuine anger emanated from his young comrade, both associated with thoughts about his mother. Once when he learned that a comrade's mother had died of broken heart upon hearing of her son's arrest. And again, one frigid night in Milan, when, walking past a posh hotel, Caserio's attention fixed upon an old and ill-clothed woman seated outside. Her job was to remain there all night and guard against thieves. Caserio pressing some coins into her frozen hands and in a trembling voice declared, "A society that permits such infamy deserves no pity." Caserio, of course, then went on to, he was arrested, he fled the country, ended up in France, and shortly thereafter, after killing the president of France, was tried and executed and guillotined. The second part I would like to read is a description of Gaetano Bresci. Gaetano Bresci, as some of you might know, assassinated King Umberto of Italy on July 29, 1900. Bresci was born in the town of, it's more of a hamlet, of Coiano near Prato in Tuscany in 1861. He was a very skilled weaver and worked in the city's burgeoning industry. As a young man, he became an anarchist, for which he was arrested and sentenced to 1 year of internal exile, after which he emigrated to the United States, where he made a living, a good living, as a weaver in Paterson, New Jersey. Life was good for Bresci in the United States. He was well paid. He was a skilled worker. He married, had a daughter, And by the time he decided to go back to Italy to perform his deed, his wife was actually pregnant with a second child, Gaetanino, who he would never see. However, like many radicals, Bresci's body was while Bresci's body was in the United States, his mind and his heart continued to be in Italy. And he was particularly incensed by the violent repression against workers during the so-called Fatti di Maggio in Milan. In 1898, high bread prices led to demonstrations all over Italy. In Milan, an unarmed crowd of protesters marched towards the center of town, guarded by a strong military force under the command of General Bava Beccaris. The crowd ignored the order to disperse, whereupon Bava Beccaris gave the signal to fire with muskets and cannons, resulting, of course, in scores, maybe hundreds of deaths. 2 years later, Bresci returned to Italy, determined to kill the king. Bresci specifically targeted Umberto first for punishment because he had signed the decree imposing martial law, and then bestowed Italy's highest military decoration on the general who had ordered grape shot to be used against defenseless demonstrators in Milan. The section here I'm going to read, which is not very long, is a description of the morning of the event. So the few hours between the time he woke up and his assassination of the king. Having learned from newspapers that King Umberto planned to visit Monza to observe a contest of gymnasts at the Royal Park, Bresci reconnoitered the scene for 2 days, asking local coach drivers, vendors, and even the carabinieri specific questions about the king's habits, claiming he wished to see His Majesty close up. Having decided that the best time to strike would be at the conclusion of the festivities, Bresci began his preparations the night before, cleaning his revolver and cutting crosses into the lead bullets with scissors to increase their lethality. He spent the day of the fatal encounter as if on a holiday. He arose around 10 a.m. He spent almost 2 hours washing, shaving, and cleaning his nails. Fastidious as always about his appearance, Bresci dressed himself in a hazel jacket, a hat of the same color, a black necktie with a gold pin, a gold watch and chain, a jeweled ring. Leaving his pensione around noon, Bresci stopped first at a dairy bar and ate ice cream, and half an hour later sat down in an outdoor seat at the Café del Vapore and ordered lunch. The proprietor observed that his customer appeared melancholic and asked if anything was troubling him. Bresci responded, "Today will be a terrible day for me." He also spoke about his wife and child in a manner evidencing how much he missed them. To pass the time, Bresci invited a young man in the restaurant to join him at his table for a chat. He introduced himself as Caserio, a choice suggesting preoccupation with his mission and awareness of the fate that most likely awaited him. As the two men conversed, Bresci appeared increasingly nervous, especially when 2 carabinieri walked past. After paying the bill for himself and his lunch companion, Bresci bid the young man farewell, saying, "Look at me carefully, because you will perhaps remember me for the rest of your life." He spent the remainder of the day walking around town and returning to the dairy bar 4 times for ice cream. He ate 5 ice creams that day. By evening, Bresci had entered the Royal Park, hoping to position himself along the road by which the king would enter, thereby giving him a chance to escape. But the crowd was so dense that he was pushed toward the center of activities within 3 meters of the spot where the king's carriage would park. The location was optimum for his purpose, but afforded no possibility of escape. Undaunted, Bresci patiently awaited the moment when he would avenge the peasants and workers killed during the Fasci Siciliani and the Fatti di Maggio. And so he did. So I chose to read these sections because really this is one of the many ways, of course, that you can really hear Nunzio's voice that runs through all the book. But his real ability, his ability to personalize the accounts and the stories that he describes. By the end of the 19th century, Italian anarchists were commonly depicted by the press, by political elites, and even by social scientists and criminologists as a bloodthirsty menace. It was not uncommon for bourgeois newspapers to publish drawings depicting Italians in swarthy, unshaven, malevolent grins on their face, chest exhibiting banners bearing the words anarchy, right hand holding a smoking revolver, or more often a bloody dagger. None of the Italian assassins described in this book, and in the book there are accounts of 4 assassins and 2 failed assassins, bore even the slightest resemblance to this grotesque portrait. Gross representations of Italians and anarchists in the press merely conformed to the ubiquitous tendency of government officials and public opinion at large to regard Italians in general, and Italian anarchists in particular, as demonic menace to society, a kind of a phenomenon not dissimilar to the treatment of Mexicans, Muslims, and Central Americans today. The image of the anarchist as a demented and murderous creature still dominates contemporary popular culture and mind, while the term anarchy has become synonymous with violence and chaos. The assassinations committed by Italian anarchists in the 1890s certainly qualified the fin de siècle as one of the most violent periods in the history of anarchism. However, the portrayal of anarchists as a cult of madmen not only divests the assassinations of political intent and importance, but also raises the specter of a conspiracy, this notion, of course, that they were part of a conspiracy. The possibility that an attentat, that an attack, was committed by a single individual was almost inconceivable to authorities. Reports of international conspiracies, true or fabricated, and most of them were fabricated, facilitated government repression. In fact, the book shows attentatori were neither madmen, criminals, nor members of a conspiracy. Ranging in age from 21, Caserio, to 31 for Bresci, on average, attentatori were in their mid-20s when they committed their deeds. Overall, they could be described as quite ordinary members of the Italian working class. As we have seen, Caserio was a baker, and Bresci was a skilled worker. Lucchini was unusual in that he's the one who killed Sissi. He served willingly as a soldier and subsequently as a manservant to his former commander, occupation anarchists would generally have disdained. Angiolillo, who killed Canovas, the Prime Minister of Spain, came from the petty bourgeoisie, trained as a printer like his father. He was also the only assassin who was relatively well educated, having graduated from technical high school, Scuola Tecnica, in his hometown. Bresci had frequented a professional school for specialized weavers. Of the others, none had been formally educated beyond the 3rd grade. If even that, a level normative for Italian artisans and workers at the time, when woeful economic circumstances often relegated public education to the status of an unattainable luxury. The geographic origins of the assassins differed appreciably without any discernible pattern. Several grew up in small towns adjacent to or near major and middle-sized towns, Caserio not too far from Milan, Lucchini not too far from Parma, Bresci, Prato. Angiolillo was the only southerner, hailing from Foggia in Puglia. None had been exposed to radical ideas or activities within their immediate family. Their social association with anarchist movements varied, from deep involvement, Caserio, Angiolillo, and Bresci, to almost none at all for Lucchini. Although the book delves into the individual lives and personalities of the attentatori, our approach rejects any notion of Italian anarchist violence as solely or primarily a function of individual psychology. Interpretations based on psychology, as you can well imagine, cannot account for the behavior of the attentatori. Empirical evidence pertaining to their personalities is minimal and generally derived second or third hand. Moreover, any psychological approach to Italian assassins could or would inevitably be superficial and based on an a priori assumptions and conjunctions. Even if such a procedure were scientifically legitimate, 4 assassins constitute a sample far too small to yield any valid generalization and conclusion. Simply put, there's no psychological profile that fits each of the Italian anarchist assassins. No one-size-fits-all explanation of their behavior. Although to claim that emotional factors played no role in the behavior of the attentatori would be absurd, of course. What remains elusive is what turbulent process occurred inside the minds of the assassins. What propelled them to strike out with violence, especially since none had exhibited violent behavior before they committed their act. In final analysis, the most that can be said about this group is that their motivations derive from a complex mix of multiple causes and catalysts, namely class origin, economic privation and unemployment, government repression of the movement and police persecution of the individual, the travails of migration or exile, and, in few cases, some degree of emotional instability. Delving into the individual experiences of each attentatore reveals that Sante Caserio's emotional makeup was highly sensitive and fragile, and his profound empathy for the poor and the oppressed caused him considerable distress. Caserio's assassination of Sadi Carnot, however, was an act of revenge for the execution of the French anarchist Auguste Vaillant, who had thrown a bomb in the French parliament and had killed no one, but still was guillotined. In contrast, Angiolillo became politically active as a Republican while still a student. His activities as an anarchist resulted in imprisonment and exile. Willing to avenge the brutal torture and execution of Spanish anarchists in the dungeons of Montjuic in Barcelona, Angiolillo exhibited characteristic composure and resignation when he fatally shot Cánovas del Castillo, apologizing for the deed to his new widow, but noting that she had married a beast. He said, "I'm sorry I killed him, but he was a beast." So, Lucchini assassinated Empress Elizabeth with emotionalness, efficiency, for no other reason, sir, except that she was very prominent. She was not his first choice. Finally, Bresci was a polar opposite to the young Caserio. Notoriously taciturn and emotionally self-contained, Bresci was stone cold in his determination to avenge his own suffering and that of the peasants and workers brutally victimized by the government and the army in 1894 during the repression of the Fascisti Siciliani and the repression of the anarchist uprising in the Carrap and the Apuane region, and, of course, the Fatti di Maggio of 1898. Bresci continued to manifest his sang-froid at every stage of his interrogation and trial. Even when sentenced to the ergastolo, life in prison, Bresci maintained an air of disdainful indifference towards his accusers and his own fate, a stance that generated great pride and inspiration for generations of anarchists. Therefore, the essential commonality linking most of the assassins described in this book was the conceptualization of their deeds as a form of political violence that did not constitute assassination under societal definitions of murder. They were, in Italian, they were giustizieri. In the lexicon of Italian anarchists, the giustiziere was the avenging executioner who exacted retribution for the victims of state violence and oppression. All four of the attentatori struck out against those monarchs and chiefs of state deemed responsible directly or indirectly for crimes perpetrated against themselves, the people, and the anarchist movement. What made the Italian anarchist giustiziere perhaps unique or certainly rare in the annals of political assassination was the clear distinction they made between the office and the individual. That is to say, the official position of their target as opposed to the person of flesh and blood who occupied it. When, during the trial, when Bresci was confronted by the prosecutor and said, "You killed a great father, you killed Umberto," he said, "No, I did not kill Umberto, I killed the king." The counter-argument would hold that victims struck down by Italian anarchists hardly qualified as genuine tyrants, but whom the anarchists considered a tyrant must be understood through the working class perspective. King Umberto was lauded by middle and upper classes as il re buono, the good king, whereas for anarchists and much of the working class, he was il re mitraglia, the grape shot king, whose crimes merited death. The same argument could be made for the assassinations of Carnot in France and Cánovas in Spain. Properly viewed in the context of Italy's grinding poverty and authoritarian methods of dealing with popular unrest and dissent, along with the economic and political pressures that fostered mass migration, combined with the cosmopolitan nature of Italian anarchism, the attentats, the murders of the 1890s, collectively represent desperate acts of protest and rebellion against a political system and social order based on inequality, exploitation, and oppression. The attentats sounded a clarion, reminding to the ruling political class and the bourgeoisie, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." This call was finally heard when Bresci assassinated King Umberto, a deed that underscored the maladies afflicting Italian society and helped change the course of the nation's political history. With Bresci's deed, the so-called heroic period of Italian anarchism came to an end, opening the door for the movement to develop greater ideological complexity, to develop an energetic militancy that endured until World War I, a period in which anarchist violence played virtually no role in Italy. And that's it. That's it.
So before we open the floor to your questions or comments, I just want to remind you that there are copies of the book downstairs for you to purchase, and as Fraser will sign them for you.
It'll be worth a quarter more.
And Fraser, one of the things we were discussing when you first told me that you were working on this book are some myths that surround these assassins. And myths probably that were also part of the very anarchist propaganda, because they're beautiful myths, like the one surrounding Bresci and these meeting that allegedly took place in Paterson, New Jersey. It was indeed a world capital of anarchism.
Yeah.
And it was a combination of Italian and Spanish anarchists that lived in Paterson, correct?
Mostly Italian, though.
Mostly Italian. So, but what happens really in Paterson? How they do decide that somebody should punish the king for having sanctioned with these honor General Baba Beccaris? Tell the myth and tell the truth.
Right, right. Well, the myth is, it's actually, you're right, it's a great story. The myth is that a group of anarchists got together, they drew cards or straws, whoever, and whoever got the...
In Paterson,
New Jersey, right. And whoever got the shortest straw, or the lowest card, then would be given a gun that would have been bought there locally, and then would have gone on his way to Italy to kill the king. So this notion, of course, that there was somehow in this very vibrant, Paterson truly is, it's the only, by the end of the 19th century, it's the only place in the only place in the world outside of Argentina where anarchist newspapers in Italian are being printed. So it really is the capital of Italian anarchism is in New Jersey. But anyhow, so this whole notion that out of this community, which was a very, very active community of a couple of thousand, that this plot would be conceived in which people would come together and actually plan and decide to kill the king. And the idea was that Bresci had drawn the short straw and been given his gun and had gone off to Europe to kill the king. Well, this never happened. Of course, never happened for two basic reasons. First of all, these were anarchists, right? So the notion, of course, that somebody would get down and that somebody would decide that somebody else would do something of this nature seems really kind of contrary to the anarchist state of mind. And also, anarchists were very much aware, and this is a tradition that really goes back to the Risorgimento. They were very much aware of how thoroughly infiltrated they were by informants. So really, this notion that in this, we were talking about it before in your office, even, if you go back to Mazzini, all of the revolts that Mazzini tried to organize during the Risorgimento, the authorities knew about them, weeks before they ever took place. And the same thing is true about anarchist activities in Italy and outside of Italy. They were really very, very much aware of how thoroughly infiltrated they were. So both, the kind of anti-authoritarian structure of the anarchist movement, which would have prevented the kind of decision-making process that would have led to something of this nature, as well as their awareness of how exposed they were to authorities, really makes this story really quite ludicrous. So the question is, why does this story exist? And it's not the only story. You'll see in every one of these cases, from Caserio all the way to Bresci and beyond, authorities, and the part in the book that's really interesting is that what we have for the Bresci case, not only do we have all the investigations being conducted in Italy, but we also have all the investigations being conducted in the United States by U.S. authorities. So we have a really full picture of the response by governments on both sides of the Atlantic to these events. in all of the interrogations and there's always this persistent theme. Who set you up for this? Because, of course, on the part of to use this vague term, the bourgeoisie, of course, there was this inability to really recognize that these acts of violence, lèse-majesté, against political leaders, inability to recognize that they were the product of hardship, they were a product of economic circumstances and conditions in Italy and elsewhere. Italy at the end of the 19th century, political franchise was down to 6%, poverty was endemic, recurring economic crises. So there was really this unwillingness to recognize that out of very, very dire social, economic, and political circumstances, violence of this kind could really be perceived for many as an only outlet to express their views, was rejected. And so the search was always for a master puppeteer somewhere. At some point, there was even a theory that the former queen of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Bourbon queen, and Enrico Malatesta had conspired together, which actually had happened. There had been a meeting between the two, which is kind of ironic. But anyhow, had conspired together to kill the king. And this is one of the reasons why Bresci, within 1 year of being sent to solitary confinement, the first year of his life sentence, was actually strangled in jail, in prison. But really, the sense that it had to be a conspiracy, that somebody like Sante Caserio, who had a third, a very, very basic primary school education, could not only kill someone, but also be so articulate in his presentations during the trial, was inconceivable. And this explains the reason for these myths. Yeah, for these myths. Il complotto. There's always a sense. Who set you up to it?
And Fraser, another thing that is very interesting is within anarchism, of course, there are the assassins, the most famous are the ones we know. Were there inner currents within the anarchist movement that would advocate more the use of violence or less the use of violence? Because it seems that like a very fluid, without a centralized, recognized method. Say there are many.
Right.
And so I was wondering whether within the anarchist movement itself, were there any people that were skeptical about the efficacy or the morality of propaganda by deeds, as they called it?
Right. Well, it's a complicated question, but I think there's two facets to that question. Clearly, in a situation in which there was no form of legal political expression possible, the moment, and this is really the tone of Italy at the end of the 19th century, particularly under the rule of, during the period of Crispi, of his tenure as prime minister, an incredible repressive apparatus is put into place in Italy, so that in fact anybody who expresses, even in some cases, the mildest form of critique or dissent can't be sent without going through a trial, is sent to internal exile. And internal exile really spells economic ruin for family, for children, for wives. I mean, it's a very, very serious, repressive measure, which in most cases is just done by fiat, by local police authorities. They deem that somebody's a danger to society, and they send them off for 3, 4, or they can send them to jail, actually, for 2 or 3 years, and then off to internal exile for a long period of time. So the apparatus, the repressive apparatus, is really, really horrific. And there really is no legitimate form, at least until the early 1890s, of political expression through the parliamentary system. So that certainly makes violence, responding to official government violence, institutional violence with violence, is very, in many ways, I wouldn't even say it's appealing, but certainly seems to many as being the only way.
Sense, yeah.
The other element, however, that is very interesting, and I think this is something that we deal with in the book, is a comparison between the use of violence by French anarchists, Spanish anarchists, and Italian anarchists. Clearly, in the case of Italian anarchists, as I mentioned, although there's a whole series of bombings in the 1880s and early 1890s, there are bombings almost every day. But as we would say in Italian, they're mostly petardi, they're mostly fireworks. The purpose is to attack buildings as a symbol of power and repression. And if somebody gets hurt, it's usually the anarchists, because they were great at ideas, but they were terrible chemists. Or if somebody gets hurt, it's somebody, there was no intention of hurting someone. So the targets are always very, very specific. They're buildings. And when, as the 4 cases I mentioned, when anarchists do commit, they assassinate, kill someone, it's very, very clear who they want to kill. It's a very specific target. And there are specific reasons behind this decision. In comparison, instead, Spanish and French anarchists, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but it kind of works. Their enemies are really class enemies. They're not specific individuals. It's a social class. So you'll have in France, for instance, anarchists will throw bombs in restaurants, because of course restaurants as a symbol, particularly restaurants near train stations, as a symbol, only the bourgeoisie goes and eats in a restaurant. So if you kill a bourgeois, whoever he or she may be, or even a child, you're killing a class enemy. In the same case in Spain, well, there's this in Barcelona actually. There's several incidents in which bombs are thrown at religious processions. There too, we don't really know who threw the bomb, because rather than throwing the bomb at the head of the procession where all the dignitaries would be, they would throw them at the end of the procession. So you don't know whether it was just bad aim, or maybe it was a provocateur, because the people at the end of the procession usually tended to be old ladies and no one of any substance. But there too, the targets were symbols of oppression, not specific individuals. And so, who got blown up, who got blown up. The Italian anarchists, in this sense, for a movement that is cosmopolitan, they're very national in their depiction of who to hit. They go after precise and specific individuals, accused and held responsible of specific actions, and as such, they hit them.
With the exception of Sissi, they were right. I mean, in terms of the targets they picked.
Yeah. Sissi is, she's really an aberration in the whole story. Lucchini wanted to hit a pezzo grosso. He didn't find a pezzo grosso, so he found a pezza grossa. And so, she was just wandering, just on the lakefront, and he, stabbed her. And that was, nobody really it didn't really make much sense. Except, of course, that it was his way of expressing and voicing his frustration and marginalization within society.
Yes.
In Europe, the governments were able to infiltrate quite effectively the anarchic movements of the anarchists, and still in Paterson, the community of the anarchists arrives to have about 2,000.
Speak a little louder, please.
In Paterson, the anarchists were, the self-proclaimed anarchists, at some point were about 2,000, and they had publications that everybody knew. How come they were allowed to develop to such a number in the US, even though their ideology was very well known and publications were there? Why was the US government not more effective in repressing them?
Well, that's a really good question. There are two things that are of significance. There's this wonderful letter that Bresci writes his brother-in-law, I believe it is, and he writes about the United States in glowing terms. Here we can express our views and nothing happens to us. Here we can publish our, now whether that's true or not, but that was certainly his perception. His perception was that this in some ways, this was a place where anarchists could clearly express their views and not fear any retaliation. In terms of Paterson, when U.S. authorities, consular authorities, turn to both authorities in New Jersey and in New York, asking them to investigate anarchist activities, that is the first time that authorities in both in New York and in New Jersey even realize that there's a large anarchist community in Paterson. They had completely ignored it and really had not paid too much attention. So they really have to, there's a lot of scrambling that goes on. That's really why that's the case. In terms of a repressive apparatus of the state, a period that I'm really very, very familiar with are the 1920s and 30s, working within Italian police records. And whatever we might think about Italian bureaucracy, but when it came to sovversivi, they were very good. They were very good, not just in accumulating information, but also in analyzing and understanding its significance. Again, I'm talking about the 20s and 30s, so you're dealing with the FBI, which did not exist at the end of the 19th century. In comparison, the FBI's investigation of subversive activities, you really get a sense that the informants were being paid by the pound of paper they produced, because they completely had no understanding of what they were going after, what they were looking for. So I haven't answered your question, but that's the best I can do.
Could it be also the fact that they didn't bring any major attack to dignitaries in the U.S.?
You had the
Or
McKinley
were there?
assassination.
It was.
You had the McKinley assassination.
Right.
But not,
The President of the United States.
but not by an Italian anarchist.
No,
Polish
but it was anarchistic.
No, but
Yeah.
they passed an anarchist exclusion act after the McKinley assassination.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Then there were a bunch of
You- In describing the individuals who were doing the shooting, it came across that they were people who were administering justice, for the most part, against
Justicia,
Italians.
yes.
Did they or their supporters give thought to, or have a theory or theories of how doing these things might bring about change, inspiring people, building a movement or whatever, or in addition to just getting rid of people who deserve perhaps to be gotten rid of? What would this accomplish?
Well, the idea is that you are clearly the definition of the state and the power of the state is much more. It's very different from what it was now, right? From the way we see it now. So clearly, the king, the president, the prime minister are the embodiment, are the symbol, and in many ways are the kind of the center, the locus of the state at the end of the 19th century. So the notion, of course, that you attack and you kill these characters that represent the power and the repressive power of the state, both as symbols, but actually because of their acts and deeds, was seen by some as a reasonable alternative. And in the case of Italian anarchists did not invent regicide. In fact, attacks on kings and emperors are very much part of the tradition of the Risorgimento, of the period before Italian unification. And that is something else that we go into the book, that in fact, during the period of the Risorgimento, there are not only a slew of attacks by Italian patriots against, whether it be Napoleon III, attempts against Franz Joseph of Austria, and these are characters and experiences that actually they enter the pantheon of the symbols of Italian unity and Italian patriotism before 1861. So in fact, anarchists draw on this tradition, but just they extend it from the struggle for national independence to the struggle for social justice.
Yes.
You said that there are many myths concerning the anarchists, that there's conspiracy theories and the majority of them were unfounded. And if you look at the Gladio operations in Italy in the 60s, 1960s and 1980s, and the Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due, being involved in that, and its founding going back to the period in which you're talking about, what operations do you see that were actually conspiracies and that people were involved in, that were conspiratorial? Because the same methods are being used, but also one thing that's really key that I didn't hear you speak about is false flag operations. So a false flag operation is actually the government attacking itself to go ahead and further its ability to have a greater central authority to, for example, what's going on now, the increase of the NSA, Homeland Security Act, things of this nature. As Robert Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So I'm kind of curious if you see any aspect of false flag operations. It may not be someone from the outside, it actually may be somebody from within the government.
We actually talk about it in the book. During the bombing campaign.
And you can only have one person acting to
Right.
do that, right? You don't need a whole big thing. You can have a lone wolf operation happening, and we see that today in different various operations around the world.
During the bombing campaigns of the 1880s and 1890s, it's very, very hard to distinguish between actions of provocateurs and legitimate actions. Acts committed by anarchists. Legitimate, that I just that's a bad choice of word. But anyhow, it's interesting slip. But we do recognize that it's possible, because all you really need to do is to build an explosive and blow something up and put it in a church or put it somewhere else, or there are a couple of attacks to the Italian building of the Italian Parliament. So that's really, really hard to distinguish. And you're right, it is possible.
The ones that you mentioned, especially the church, as far as the religious leaders were not attacked, but the people in the back of the procession were repeatedly attacked, and those were the old ladies.
Yeah, but that's in Spain. That's
right.
not the Italian. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it is possible. In terms of the connection between possible conspiracies and the stay behind ideas of the Cold War in the 1950s, they're just two very, very different set of circumstances. But in the context of the period that we deal with, it's not in the case of the assassinations, because we know a lot about the assassins, and I didn't mention the failed assassins. We know a lot, and it's clear that they weren't masterminded, or they weren't being controlled by somebody else. The bombings, it's possible. But yes, it is. Clearly, the state always has its own interest in fostering violence of a certain kind in a certain direction at certain times, and it's possible that they did the same thing at this period.
Yes.
Yeah, two things. First, I have a question for you about the genealogy of the book. Could you explain, talk a bit more about the relationship you and Nunzio had, and how this book kind of came to what's the word I want to use? Flowered out of the Italian anarchism book you wrote previously. And secondly, I want to follow up on a question you asked about nonviolent anarchists. Well, during this time in Lombardia, there's this whole egoist movement in a legalism where it's kind of drop out of society, and is less interested in the collective class action of blowing up the bourgeoisie, people like Renzo Navatore and Leo Raffanelli. This is in 19-teens, and also this contemporary in America in the 1880s and 1890s. There's this individualist anarchist movement with people like Benjamin Tucker, Josiah Warren, who aren't very much interested in destroying the federal government, but are more very Thoreauian of kind of going off and forming a commune and working collectively that way. So it's not just a violent tradition. Like Fraser touched on earlier, this is really out of the Risorgimento, where this propaganda of the deed becomes a thing.
Yeah, and the insurrections. Yeah, that's a big. The genesis of the book. Nunzio wrote. I mean, Nunzio's written a lot, but there's essentially two fundamental books. The first was a history, origins of Italian anarchism, which was 1860s to 1892, and then he wrote the definitive biography on Carlo Tresca. So this book really was in his mind, a continuation of the first book. Was, you know, bringing the history of anarchism from the early part of the 19th century to 1900, to the turn of the century, after which, you know, with the rise of the Socialist Party, the broadening of the franchise in Italy, the rise of an active labor movement, I mean, the kind of direction of the social movements changed dramatically. So this is what he was working on, and I mean, there are plenty of anecdotes. Marianne can probably tell more anecdotes about Nunzio's writing than I can at the time. But when he died, he pretty much dropped on my desk 700 pages, 16, 17, 18 different chapters in various forms. And with Marcella, actually, and Marianne, when we went through his office in Pennsylvania, I cleared out his desk of all of his notes. So this is kind of what I had. And what I think he was really struggling with, he had these great stories. He had these great accounts of mostly of these. You know, I read you, the parts that I read were really his words to kind of give you a sense of the sensitivity, the way he played with words, the way he really provided a very clear sense of who these individuals are by combining anecdotes with showing them how they were relevant to their actions. But I kind of had to make sense of all of this. So after I went through all of his stuff, and we actually met once. He called me in March. We met, I think it was in May, and we had this long conversation over a period of a couple of days. He was clearly in pain, but talking about this material really. It was a very, very interesting and great experience. And you know, my hope was that we would have more conversations after that, but we didn't, because he died shortly after. So essentially what I did for 2.5 years, first thing I had to get into his head. This material had to become mine. And that took some time. And then I had to, you know, these 700 pages, and this is a story about, I don't know which one of his books, Marianne, you probably remember. Which book did he write? He actually had to cut it by 50% because it was 1,200. Tresca, right? It was, you know, 1,200 pages. So that's what I had to do. And then I had to create a story that tied together all of these chapters. And then I wrote the introduction and the conclusion, in addition to updating the bibliography and going over the footnotes. So it took about 2.5 years. When he called me, I was, you know, ready to go on to my book, the one that is still staring at me on my desk because I haven't been able to touch it in a while. So it was the last thing I really wanted to do. But the moment I got into it, it was a wonderful experience. Not only was it the fact that somebody like him, and you really had to know Nunzio, would trust me to do something like this was really a great honor. But on the other hand, it pushed me in the direction of my own work, and that was really, really very, very, very interesting. And you know, I think I'm very pleased with the result. I also like that it was published by Illinois, which is an institution that denied him tenure. So I thought there was some poetic justice there. And they did a wonderful job. The title of the book is not mine; it's theirs. I mean, you know, Illinois in this sense has been great. I came up with something very academic and boring and you know, and descriptive, and they, you know, assassins AAOO. That's absolutely great.
So, well, do you want to answer that second question and then about the Spooner? Okay. I have a certain sort of paradox of your presentation, which is that, you know, there's always going to be another king, there's always going to be another prime minister, there's always going to be another police chief who you can assassinate based on, you know, they're bad people, blah, blah, blah. So the ideology is always open to further killings. But the puzzle I have is that why did it stop? Because the people you've profiled are very individualist.
Mhm.
They're not controlled by sort of the social movement. They're kind of a DIY, assassins. So you would think that there'd be much more of them, because it is a kind of this kind of weird, sort of random connection of politics, personality, an emotional cause, etc. So how do you look at the fact that it apparently declined as opposed to increase, which is where it could have gone?
Well, I think the anarchists in the room will disagree with me, but clearly this issue of consensus is not something that even the state and those in power have to address in the early part of the 20th century. And in the case of Italy, as in many other countries, there is a broadening of the franchise. There is a rise of a vibrant socialist movement, which on the eve of World War I really is the dominant party. I mean, it has the largest number of representatives in the Italian parliament. So clearly there are ways for disenfranchised, oppressed, marginalized workers, whether they be farm workers or industrial workers in Italy, to express and to voice their concerns, their views in a constructive fashion, which would have not been possible in a period in which they did not have the right to vote. They did not have, their activities would be immediately and violently repressed. So clearly, confronted with a repressive state, the only option was to respond to violence with violence. As the nature of the bourgeois state changes in the 20th century, you see in the case of Italy clearly a demise of anarchist movements and the rise of the Socialist Party, and the rise of both socialist-led and syndicalist labor organizations. So this kind of sentiment, this feeling of oppression is then directed finds an outlet by legal means as opposed to violent means.
But do you think that's partly because the anarchists themselves thought this was an counterproductive actions, and so that instead of expanding the amount of terrorists, it's sort of contracted? And you see within the working class movement that the rise of the socialists may have been part of the working class movement's kind of its own critique of this earlier period of kind of Bakuninist anarchism.
Well, when you can't vote, the difference between being able to vote and not being able to vote is a very, very significant development that takes place. I mentioned it earlier. Clearly, the vast mass of support that anarchists draw from. I mean, you always have the individual who, and there's a bombing in the early 1920s at the Diana in Milan. I mean, it's not that it ends, but clearly, as far as the vast majority of marginalized and oppressed Italian workers, there are different ways of conveying. They find different ways of conveying their views. And I think the most important shift is when Andrea Costa, who is one of the leaders of the anarchist movement, shifts over to the Socialist Party, and actually, he becomes a pariah for anarchists because he's elected to parliament, and he was really one of the leaders of the anarchist movement in Romagna, which is one of the centers of Italian anarchism. And he becomes a pariah because he once he enters parliament, he has to swear allegiance to the king and the Statuto Umbertino. But really, that represents the beginning of the end of Italian anarchism, and that's probably the reason why. Or certainly the reason why Nunzio's first book ended with 1892, because that's really a crucial moment that marks the rise of organized socialism in the United States, away from Bakunin's influence.
You also have most in Germany and the SPD.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
I have a question about Bresci's time in Paterson. Do you know if I teach in Paterson and still got a very vibrant immigrant community, and there's a lot of back and forth between the homeland and the immigrant community, and I'm just wondering if there was sort of like a pipeline or an intellectual pipeline going back and forth from Italy and Paterson at that time. I know there was between Ireland and John Holland and Paterson.
Right.
And many movements in Europe get their not just financial support, but sort of spiritual support from exiles in America. Was that
Absolutely,
going on?
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you think that Italy's main anarchist newspaper in the 1890s is published in Paterson.
Right, the
So-
Question Sociale.
La Questione Sociale. So people like Malatesta, I mean, it really is a bit like Barry, Vermont, or Ybor City in Florida. It really becomes one of the go-to places, but certainly Paterson more than anyone else, more than anywhere else. It is the place where Italian anarchists, and the interesting thing about the Italian anarchist movement in Paterson is that, as Stefano mentioned, it really is international, not only in ideology, but in composition. You actually have a significant Spanish-speaking and even English-speaking presence that works with Italian anarchists in Paterson. But absolutely, it really is. I mean, if there's a highway of global Italian anarchism, well, Paterson is one of those stops. People don't get off. They go, they spend time, and then they move on. But clearly, for somebody like Bresci, that was it was moving in his own, not only professionally. It's the silk capital of the world.
Right.
Was he? This was a place where he could make a very, very good living. But in terms of the community that he created and found and was a part of, that was a good place for him to be.
Yeah. Did he was arrested in Italy before he came here?
Yeah. He actually spent a year in Confino in Italy.
I'm just wondering if he was directed toward Paterson, like go to Paterson and you'll find compatriots there.
Well, but he was a skilled silk worker
Yeah.
before he left. So that was the combination. And as you well know, in the immigrant experience, the amount of information that goes back and forth is very, very impressive. So between newspapers and comrades going back and forth, and job opportunities, there was. I mean, that seemed like the obvious place for him to go.
And I ask the last question, and it is also based on your conclusion, that is this question, terrorists or giustizieri? And there is a sub-question, is the book going to be published in Italy?
Well, I'm going to Italy in December, and I'm bringing a whole bunch with a couple of people I want to talk to and see if it can.
Because the question to me, terrorists or giustizieri, is very, very interesting for the Italian case, with what we were discussing before. How come that all the assassins that come with the Risorgimento, Mazziniani and so on, that did exactly the same deeds,
They're heroes, they're national heroes.
Squares and streets and boulevards in every Italian city, next to the kings that were killed by the anarchist assassins. So in Mantova, Corso Umberto crosses via Oberdan. And so why those were sort of canonized and these are still vilified? Why did those end up being the assassins only and the other ones were the giustizieri?
It's interesting that in the 1870s in Italy, as they were naming, squares for Oberdan or Orsini or Battisti later, of course, because he was killed during World War I. But as early as the 1870s, in that moment of transition, right, that you have between the struggle for national independence and many of those because many of the people who do participate in that many of those who become politically active as anarchists and socialists, but mostly anarchists, many of them have actually been active in the Risorgimento. So you find them, participating in several invasions of Rome and the Battle of Mentana. I mean, there are all these different characters. But already in the 1870s, as these streets are being named, you do have, William Tell, the opera. You've got the tyrant who's killed. There is an awareness on part of, and I'm using this term very loosely, the ruling class. There is a term, are we doing the wrong thing? Are we providing examples or recognition for a behavior that can then come back and haunt us later? So it's not just so much something we don't even have to, it's not even a conversation we need to, well, it's certainly a conversation we can have now, but already in the 1870s, right right after Italian unification, as the first international and as Bakunin and his acolytes were active in Italy, fomenting revolts and uprisings left and right. There's this whole conversation: is it a good idea to name a square after Oberdan, who after all tried to kill the emperor? Should we encourage this behavior? So it's a contradiction that was recognized at the time as well.
But in the 1870s, though, those deeds were functional to the unification of Italy.
Right, but it's also a moment in which you do start having upheavals. You have the first anarchist insurrections that are very similar. La Rivolta in Matese, for instance, which is very, very similar to what people like Pisacane or the Bandiera brothers and others had done and had failed, and just like them, this one failed as well. But clearly they're drawing, if in many ways it's not so much Bakunin that inspires Italian anarchists, but it's the experience of the Risorgimento. They're drawing from that experience.
But timing is everything.
I'm sorry?
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
Yes,
The
no,
same
of
thing
course.
done 10, 20, 30 years later makes the whole difference.
Yes.
If you try to kill Mussolini or you kill Aldo Moro, it's not the same, no?
No, absolutely,
Okay,
no, of
because
course.
this is a discussion we had in Italy now.
Oh yes, absolutely.
At the time of terrorism, and
Yeah.
terrorists said, but we are like the people in the
Like-
resistance,
right, right.
not like this. I think it's the same. Timing is most important.
But that's what they were drawing on in terms of their experience. Yeah.
Well, I think we owe a big thanks to Fraser for the generosity with which he shared with us the adventure that brought to the genesis of this book, and also gave us a sense how fascinating and intricate it is. And good luck in publishing it in Italy. Thank you.